about it. And that our task for this end of day plenary, our opportunity really, is to hear briefly from the reflectors who have so generously offered to try to sum up and give some few reflections on the different sessions that they were at, so that we can all have a sense of the flavor and a bit of the content of each other's sessions, because we can't all be in one place, more than one place. So I'm asking each of the reflectors to keep their remarks to 3 to 5 minutes, and they've agreed to do that. And we're going to start with the morning sessions and with the first person, and each of the reflectors, if you could say which track and which topics you talked about today. So let's start with Kim Park Nelson. Thanks, Kim. Yeah, and if you could stand by the podium so that the live streaming can pick it up.
Hi, I'm Kim Park Nelson. I'm reporting on joint session for thematic area 123 from this morning, connections to birth culture and birthkin and openness. We had a couple of presenters, and I'm going to kind of briefly talk about, in a second, I'm going to briefly talk about what kind of summarize those presentations. But mostly our group, as I just said, talked about openness and adoption, homeland visits, birth family search, and then to some degree in our kind of small group discussions, we also talked about sort of who should be in charge of those services. The two presenters for the group were Barbara Yingvison and Holly McGinnis. Barbara made several fabulous points. Among them, to understand, she kind of opened with, to understand the connection between adoptees and their birth countries, we must first understand the practice of clean break adoption, a practice that can lead to cognitive dissonance for adoptees when they return to birth countries, which have been erased for the adoptees, and also that the countries that have erased the departed adoptee. She talked about birth search being as much about finding information and places from one's past as much as it's about finding people, allowing adoptees to imagine themselves in their birth countries. She also made some great points about birth culture, and that birth culture is about understanding the society or country that let you go and why. She also noted about culture that it's a term that's often used as a euphemism for more difficult things that are more difficult to discuss, like birth family or race. And also that she also made a strong point that adult adoptees are present and active and engaged and need to be considered at every level of inter-country adoption policy and decision making. Holly also made a couple of many excellent points. She talked about kind of this concept of adoptee identity issues, and that these are issues that she perceives as being kind of foisted on adoptees by adoption systems, and so that kind of individualizing those issues is probably inappropriate, but at the same time there also needs to be a recognition. There needs to be a recognition of adoptee agency among adopted individuals to develop their own identities and their own communities. She also noted that it's important to recognize adoption as a form of trauma for adoptees and to develop practice that does not re-traumatize adoptees. And in this light, we perhaps need to rethink the clean break model. She ended with this idea that honesty is a primary protection that adoptees need, not false identities and lost records. So often identity information is kept from adoptees with the idea that somehow this protects them. She actually opened with a really important point that I'm going to end with, that the best interests of the child needs to be extended to the best interests of adopted individuals for the term of their lives, and for that of their descendants. This is actually a point, and here I'm kind of going away from the group just for a second because you put me behind a microphone. But this is actually a point that I feel very strongly about and I completely agree with. And I guess I'd like to challenge you, even just kind of as a thought experiment, to stop referring to adoptees always as children, but as adopted persons. And I'm kind of asking you to think about how would we think about adoption more an adopted individual individuals more holistically if we started thinking about, instead of the best interests of the child, the best interests of a human being who will spend the rest of their lives as an adopted person. So that's my.
Thank you. Yes, any final minutes. Okay, next we're going to hear from Marcia Darling.
Okay, good afternoon. So I'm reporting on Theme 5, Global Surrogacy Practices session this morning on mapping the industry and policy prospects. So this morning's session was facilitated by Lisa Ikimoto, and it sought to illuminate both the commercial and policy contexts for transnational surrogacy arrangements. Session participants divided into 6 groups, agreeing to draw, sketch, or visually represent and map their sense of the relationships, agreements, contracts, coercions, and other logistics which operate to comprise the processes of the baby-making industry. Importantly, today's session built on the work accomplished yesterday that examined some of the issues impacting key stakeholders in the surrogacy industry, namely children, even though they are voiceless, women who are pregnant in surrogacy arrangements, intending or commissioning parents, and egg providers. Participants really put their heads into the activity and produced visually engaging representations that captured the essence of the baby-making endeavor. Diagrams integrated issues as seemingly far afield as global capital, gender inequality, and class stratification with techno-scientific solutions, the pull of demand and supply, and last but not least, the legal parentage, nationality, and DNA testing of a newborn that can have up to 5 parents. We reconvened as a large group and explored possible policy approaches. Lisa noted alternate policy approaches by setting out a legal and political framework, which includes the Hague Convention on Private International Law, public international law, bilateral agreements, and I might add multilateral agreements. Right, jumping around here. Yeah, hold it. Yes, as well as regional, national, and local laws. An additional approach would integrate the roles served by professional associations when they issue guidelines and the work of community-based organizations and the media. Next, we heard 2 very brief commentaries that provided an overview of what is happening on the ground regarding surrogacy in Mexico and parts of Eastern Europe. Isabel Fulo de Grane described an emerging market for surrogacy in 2 states in Mexico, noting that it is very challenging to know exactly what is going on in terms of gathering information. She also noted that intended parents in Mexico are foreigners and that singles and same-sex couples are engaging surrogacy services in Mexico now that access to India's surrogacy apparatus is closed to them. In these 2 states in Mexico, surrogacy is often framed as altruism, with there being some question about how much surrogates know of the commercial dimensions of the procedures. The question of whether some surrogates are even being paid was raised. We also heard brief comments from Enrico Demini, who reported on surrogacy arrangements and egg harvesting in Eastern Europe, specifically in Romania and the Ukraine. Then reviewed highly informative PowerPoint presentations by Hannah Baker and Sonia Allen. Hannah's presentation sought to clarify common misunderstandings about the Hague Convention and human rights law, noting a particular concern and focus on the status of children, especially the issue of legal parentage and the child's nationality. As you know, these issues bear on one of the Hague Convention's most focused concerns, namely that each child have legal parentage and belong to a state. Hannah noted that the 76 member states in the European Union have not yet agreed to develop an international instrument on surrogacy. The Secretariat has been asked to study the issues, gather information, and report to members, making recommendations for multinational engagement towards pursuing further development of a legal instrument on surrogacy agreements. In essence, much of what we know will develop in this regard, will depend on the political will of member nations, as the Secretariat works to build bridges between member nations and to further at least minimum substantive safeguards anchored in rights-based laws that seek to ensure protection for especially women and children. Sonia's comments focused our attention on an introduction to public international law, with a particular focus on the intersection of human rights law and global surrogacy. Sonia noted that human rights law has become the moral vocabulary of our times, a very apt quote. We concluded by briefly noting several significant rights-based concerns and by noting that much needs to be done by way of educating prospective parents about the entire surrogacy policy process. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcia. And Rhoda, are you ready?
I am.
Rhoda Sherman.
Kia ora. So I have just come from our session. Joint session between, we had Group 2, the countries of origin, and Group 4, the fraud. I refer to fraud group, Karen. Of course, like so many of these, the highlights are too many. So I hope that I did the presenters, the speakers justice in my sense of what happened. It began with a very comprehensive and current look at research on relinquishment from the perspective of birth mothers, given by Ruth McCroy. Ruth talked about research that she has undertaken with Hal Grodevant, looking at what happens over time in adoption, and this study began in 1987 with the first wave through to today, to 2014 with wave 14, where some of the children are parents themselves. And I thought that was really remarkable. And unfortunately, too many implications to cover here. But point out that, as Ruth said, I wanted to share, and it's a nationwide study, unique in its longitudinal nature and in its inclusiveness. It had adoptive parents, birth children, birth parents, and across a host of different contexts. One of the implications that I picked up on was the need for more research on birth fathers. And I throw that out there as merely an observation that many probably acknowledge that men don't feature too much in our discussions and our research. Pien Bos from Netherlands gave a passionate discussion of what she called the 4 conclusions of her research. Again, forgive me if I have conveyed them, are you here? Conveyed them incorrectly. Conclusion 1, rich give money to the poor give babies to the rich. Conclusion 2, relinquishment guarantees trauma. Conclusion 3, and I'm simplifying, grossly simplifying, please. Conclusion 3, mothers will never feel like ex-mothers. They will always be mothers. And conclusion 4, time for academics to give the floor over to the new generation and for the birth mothers and the adoptees themselves to get here behind the podium. Hilbrand Westra briefly described aspects of the lived experience of being an adult adoptee and the complex expanded family. He made mention of how he would describe parents. There's the here parents, which might be the adoptive, and the their parents, which might be the birth. And he shared a compelling letter from a birth mother describing her lost motherhood, feelings of betrayal, and what was really poignant to me was a sense of feeling amputated in terms of the loss of her child. Post-presentation talk, I think everybody contributed, and it got rather heated at times, which I love these kinds of talks. Exchange of money, power imbalances, and agency for those living the experiences. Challenges of trying to hear directly from the birth mothers. Ongoing relationships between adult adoptees and birth family and the complexity of those. The legal versus the lay constructions of birth mothers. Either as not being a mother because she's given the child away, contrasted with the idea that they are and will always be mothers. The fallout, that the fallout is beyond the birth mother, because we keep referring to the birth mother, and that there is a whole extended family that may be grieving the losses when a child is relinquished. Possible notions of the birth mother recovering the child at a later date, which was fascinating to me, not something I'd given a lot of thought to. But the most salient issue that really seemed to be bouncing back and forth was being confronted with the dilemma of not having any birth mothers speaking. Given that we were talking about birth mothers and the birth mother experience, unlike having some adult adoptees who might be able to speak about their experience, we were absent of birth mothers who could speak about their experiences. And then we finally, with very little time left, divided into our groups, and we had 2 large subgroups, and I don't know what the second subgroup did. But in ours, we had extremely fruitful and animated conversations about the similarities and differences between the birth or first mothers and surrogates. And it was really fascinating when we broke that down and all of the different perspectives coming in at us to see how similar and yet in subtle ways how different these 2 groups of women are. For the comprehensive list, see Karen, she was typing away during that discussion. Some of them education, pre-placement, post-placement, healthcare, post-placement counseling, etc. So that's kind of a summary of our group, and thank you all for participating in it with me because I found it a fantastic session to be part of. Cheers. Tēnā koe.
Rhoda, thanks. And Monica Dowling next. Oh, do you want to go next? Beatrice, do you want to go next?
Yes.
Is that okay, Monica?
Is it my turn?
We're not going in a particular order.
Okay, go ahead.
Monica, and then after Monica, we'll hear from Beatrice. Thanks, Monica. So tell which session that you're reporting on.
Okay, I'm feeding back from the post-adoption support session that we had this afternoon. I've been asked to do a short feedback, so it is pretty short. First of all, I wanted to thank Katie for doing an excellent presentation, Katie Hoffman, on post-adoption support. I'm going to focus on one aspect of our discussion this afternoon because it links to a discussion on a lack of registration of surrogate mothers that we talked about in the first session, and also a bit about discussion in the second session with Holly. And that is preservation of information as part of post-adoption support throughout the life of the adopted child and into the future. I think we felt that it was something that The Hague, as we're in The Hague now and we're sort of discussing with people from The Hague, could certainly play a role in helping this preservation of information to take place from birth mothers. So how we were discussing it was that there should be a database, a secure database at The Hague for birth mothers to birth parents, not birth mothers, birth parents to register information about themselves. Would not necessarily mean that they could that the adoptive child could contact the birth parents, but the information was secured in a database at The Hague on a website that was secure and private and confidential to that child as they grew up. So it's part of post-adoption services because it's something that the child can, as they grow up and into the future, we're talking about 10 years, 20 years' time, also for children not yet born, we're talking about how can this preservation of information take place and how can agencies and governments ensure that this information is in a secure place and doesn't involve a lot of bureaucracy to get to it. And what we were discussing was how The Hague could offer guidance to agencies and to governments that as part of the deal for an international adoption, prospective adoptive parents need to know that this information will be available for their prospective adopted children and that it will be there, and they have to encourage and support as part of the post-adoption support for their child them to access it, and that this is a fundamental right. And it's actually in the best interest of the child. We had a discussion in one of the earlier sessions about the rights of the birth parents and the rights of the child. Well, this is actually in the best interest of the child, preservation of information. That's as far as we wanted to go We didn't talk about access to birth parents. We didn't talk about anything else apart from preservation of information. So I'm just going to stop there.
Thanks, Monica. And next we'll hear from Beatriz San Ramon.
Hi, in our group, which was group 4 this morning, we had the presentations by Carmen Monico and Noe Batista about the Guatemala case study, which happens to be a very powerful and complex example of how different forces came together to create a flow of at least 25,000 children between 2000 and 2007. When considering the case of Guatemala, we ended up talking about the 3 Ps of preventing trafficking, which are prevention, protection, and prosecution. So let's start with the last one, with prosecution. We asked the question this morning was, well, who was prosecuted in Guatemala? And in fact, some lawyers, a judge, and a children's home director have now been successfully prosecuted, but that was after many, many years of pushing those cases through the court. And it was highlighted the work by the Guatemalan women who experienced child abduction, the abduction of their children, who actively participate as activists in addressing the failures to persecute, right? So moving to protection and how do we protect, which will be the question. We were told about how Guatemala moved from a private system to a centralized system with the Hague Convention being a catalyst. And interestingly, our Guatemala colleagues, on one hand, they highlight or they underscore how the USA were a part of the need for the change. But at the same time, they highlight how in the aftermath of the halt of adoptions, when dealing, let's say, when cooperating between the 2 states to see what was going to happen with the adoption request, the adoption files that were in the pipeline, the relations were very much marked by the power symmetry between the 2 countries. And then when talking about protection and its connection to prevention and how we prevent illicit adoptions, we talk about that prevention is more than simply awareness. And when talking about this, we talk a lot about how important it is to truly use terms like abduction of children and not only adoption or illicit adoption, to choosing, the power of and the force of the choosing of the choice of the terms, right? So being clear about abduction. What else? Well, when talking about these 3 Ps, we also it also raised a lot of discussion about the right or the entitlement to have children or to buy children, which connects with adoption and also with global surrogacy. And my personal conclusion is that without shifting the frame, without shifting our lenses, it's different to move forward. So the fact is that, as highlighted by our Uganda colleagues, in many cases, receiving countries maintain their adoption programs regardless of the serious concerns or evidence of child abduction. And when they do so, obviously they are not doing that in the best interest of children. That's right. That's clear. So this should lead us to reframe both inter-country adoption and global surrogacy in terms of reproductive politics issues. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Beatrice. And our last reflector is Carolyn McLeod.
Okay. Hi. So I'm just reflecting on the last session for themes 3 and 5. We met together talking about the role of intermediaries in intercountry adoption and cross-border surrogacy. Let me just say this is the first time the surrogacy track people got to collaborate with people in an adoption track, and it was really exciting for me because I'm interested in both topics, and I think it was really fruitful dialogue. So our topic was really these intermediaries involved in both practices, such as the adoption agencies or the surrogacy agencies, governments, intergovernmental organizations, fertility clinics, these kinds of groups. There was some discussion about negative practices that we know of that have occurred in the past by these groups. There was discussion about those, but then the main focus was meant to be the roles of the intermediaries. And let me just say we had very helpful, interesting talks by Lisa Ikamoto and Carmel Shalev on surrogacy, and Randy Barlow and Laura Briggs on adoption. So thanks to those people who brought those talks to us. Just in terms of negative practices, I think we learned, or at least it was pointed out to me, that we know of instances of fraud in both contexts. So Lisa Ikamoto talked about examples of fraud by surrogacy agencies or lawyers in the United States, particularly in California. We know of, there have been fraud cases with adoption. There was some discussion in a breakout group I was in about cases in Canada and also in Italy. And these are cases basically of directors just pilfering client money. There was some attention to problems of deception and manipulation in advertising for surrogacy by the agencies themselves. So this happens with assisted reproductive clinics, fertility clinics generally. They'll say things like, you're guaranteed to get a child, which is of course not true. In one website that was devoted to, it was centered on for gay couples seeking a surrogate, there was one line that everyone has a right to be equal, as if legal or moral equality guaranteed that you have, the opportunity to have a biological child, which I think is just false. In terms of practices by governments, there was some discussion about discrimination against certain groups with domestic laws that govern assisted reproduction or adoption. So countries that do not allow gay couples to engage in surrogacy or adoption, for example. And there was some discussion about inadequate regulation by governments, a lack of regulation in countries where surrogacy is flourishing, particularly global surrogacy. And we also discussed concerns about the adequacy of current regulations for adoption. So there was quite a bit of discussion about negative practices, but the roles of the intermediaries. I think there was quite a bit of focus on the agencies themselves and whether they have a role in this, the screening of prospective parents and their preparation for the family that they're seeking to have, or becoming the sort of parents that they're going to become. The real question was, should this sort of screening occur for surrogacy or contract pregnancy the way it does for adoption? And I think people disagreed about that to some degree. I mean, some people are concerned about kind of classism and racism and other forces of oppression that can influence the kind of screening that goes on in adoption contexts. But others thought definitely there should be screening in some screening, not necessarily, certainly not that type, but some screening in the context of global surrogacy. So the question arises too: if screening should occur, how should it occur? Should it occur the same way it does in adoption? Noting that in some adoption contexts, this was news to me, the actual adoption agencies do the screening. That's not how it happens in Canada, but I think that happens, in the U.S., some were saying. I found that astounding. But I think the general agreement was whoever's doing any kind of screening or even preparation for the parents. It should not be the agencies themselves because they have a conflict of interest. There was discussion, just one last point about roles, the role of the agencies in record keeping records about the adoption, in the case of adoption, or the surrogacy, records that the children may want to have access to later in life, than we know many children do. We don't know that that's true in the context of surrogacy, but the question is whether we should assume that it will be true or may be true. If we don't keep the records now, we can't, allow them to have access later if they don't exist. So there was, certainly I think agreement that records, by many of us, that records should be kept. But then the question is who should keep them? Should the agencies be the ones that retain this information, or should it be some public authority that's not going to go out of business the way agencies do? So that's it.
Thank you, Carolyn. And I really want to thank all the reflectors for packing so much into their very few number of allocated minutes. And I think that it really helped me get a flavor. I hope it did help everybody. You guys did really good jobs. So we now have 45 minutes to discuss as a group. And we don't have any particular structure in mind here. We want to recall the day's activities from Deepa's keynote remarks at the beginning of the day, and reflecting on all the things that you have heard in the concurrent sessions that you've attended, as well as on that plenary presentation. So I'll put the floor open and call on people as they raise their hands and ask, are there students, volunteers who are able to pass the mics around? So either you'll get a mic brought to you, or you can come up here to the podium. So who would like to begin? Rhoda.
I think I just want to propose a topic for some discussion. There was a theme today that very much was about surrogacy and adoption. We've finally begun to kind of see them and discuss them in tandem, and I felt cheated that we didn't have more of it, because there's so much to talk about. And I enjoyed our session this morning where we had a little flavor of both in this session this afternoon, and I would like to maybe propose that if there is some more opportunity to talk about the synthesis, the similarities, the differences, that perhaps others may feel the same. Otherwise, you can tell me to shut up and move on to another topic.
Well, actually, why don't we try to stay on that topic for the beginning, at least, of this session? And it sounds like, it looks from your body language, Monica, like you have something to say on that topic.
Yeah, we didn't discuss that in our post-adoption support group this afternoon, but it was very obvious that from the discussion first thing this morning that preservation of information is a key issue for surrogacy too. And I really think that that's an issue that we can come together on, preservation of information, because it just seems obvious that it's something that surrogate adults are going to want to know about, as well as adoptive adults.
So I would subscribe for this amazing work. Did some really good work on this. So not to give you every single point, but we actually talked a little bit. We framed it up to begin with as there is the clear difference of starting places, that the mother is already pregnant with a child and there needs to be an adoption plan, or someone's decided there needs to be an adoption plan, versus with the surrogacy process with the surrogate mother, there's the need, somebody wants to purchase this service, if you call it a service. And so a difference between somebody who is pregnant and that is a process that occurred without that plan of a service versus the surrogacy market. So it starts at different places,
But then there are some really interesting similarities. So those of us who've looked at the fraud in intercountry adoption, we've had to look at the recruiter issue. People going out into communities and looking for women to pull them into an adoption process in which it actually becomes impossible to have informed consent because of how things have been framed up. And it may be a grooming of a woman to be a part of her own exploitation. And then how is that working out in the surrogacy? We know that there are issues around some surrogate women after they've done their multiple pregnancies, then they want to continue to be a part of that industry, and so then they become recruiters themselves. Let me tell you how we did this. It's improved my life. And so even the recruitment, there are some similarities that we could see. And then one of the things they were talking about is that, the idea that you would go live in a facility for the surrogate mothers, and then the birth mother homes that are still being used in some places. I know in South Korea this is a major issue. The United States, we're seeing less and less of those over time because they're very problematic models quite often. But what happens in those kinds of locations where people are living around grooming them or socializing them towards the separation between the mother and the child? What are the similarities? What are the differences? I know that the research that Rita has done around what happens in those locations has got some really powerful information in there, and I think that we need to learn more about that. What are we doing when we separate women from their families and communities, and how does consent in these processes occur? And of course, consent is at very different places in the two different experiences. So one of the things that was really important that we talked about was that the counseling that takes place, being around educating the surrogate what this is as a technological process. This isn't sex. Your husband needs to know that this isn't sex, this is not how you got pregnant, versus the counseling that might take place in a birth mother's home or let's work towards your relinquishment. So one's kind of an educational process and the other one might be preparing for this. And it could be very, quite often it can be very ethical counseling. There's actually some very good work being done with birth mothers, social workers who are safeguarding those processes and their rights. But the counseling model is quite different. And then the post-placement issue. So we know in adoption, international adoption, there's just essentially is very, very little support, if nothing, most cases. And we'd also know that's the case with the surrogate mothers. And so what is owed to these women as they deal with grief and loss? That's really profound issues. And the point was made, if the surrogacy industry were to acknowledge that there's loss, then they're going against their messaging right now. To say that we need to start providing the service then goes against the messaging that this is not their genetic child because it's gestational and all the things around this isn't a real loss. So they'd have to change their narrative to say that we're going to offer post-parent-child separation counseling opportunities. So we talked about that. There's a challenge right in there because the narrative doesn't support that kind of framing right now. So those are some of the things we looked at. And I think that this is what I was really hoping for in our process of this, of bringing these two groups together, is to start to figure out where are the similarities and what do we know about the women in intercountry adoption, because it's been going, we have this since the mid-1950s. We have a lot of information now. We don't have enough in some ways, but we do have a fair amount to inform. So does this help kind of get the conversation going a little bit more, David?
Should I come up?
Either way, whatever.
Either way.
Help to be a little more direct and more provocative, so I'll try that approach. I've worked in adoption for a long time, and I also teach bioethics, and essentially surrogacy from someone who's worked on adoption is everything we fought against in adoption magnified. And so for those of you who are just in surrogacy, and I do teach bioethics, so I know that framework, the ART framework, and you're used to that framework. And so I want to go over what, from an adoption framework, we've fought against and how surrogacy just is that when it's commercialized and is big business. We have fought to make adoption a child protection in the best interest measure for children, acknowledging that it is inherently traumatic and flawed and difficult, but that in some instances when we cannot preserve the family, and in terms of intercountry adoption, when domestic solutions are not available, we will allow this highly traumatic intervention because it's the best of the worst option that we have. And we have learned about the trauma to to the original families, not just the mothers, the fathers, the extended family, the breaches. Norma Cruz talked about the scarring on the whole nation of Guatemala today in our session when things are systematically done wrong. And we've learned that it's very difficult to do intercountry adoption well when it's demand-driven and when it's money-driven. Those are the two drivers that destroy intercountry adoption. When it becomes demand-driven for the desire of parents to parent or adults to parent and by their money, then it inherently becomes a market and it subverts the best interests of children and it decimates original families. And the purpose of the Hague Adoption Convention was to stop it from being a demand-driven, money-driven thing. That's what we've been doing for, decades. Commercial surrogacy is by definition an ART thing, that is, there's no child to help. There's no necessity of a breach. The child doesn't exist yet. The breach is people who want to parent and feel that they have a right to procreate. And that is a very real loss, the ability that you don't have children, and is very difficult. And, but it is basically demand and money driven. The other thing we've learned is that when adoption goes wrong, it involves erasure of the original relationships in the family. And that we have built the adoptive family on the erasure, the elimination of the original family relationships. And we've tried to guard against that, often unsuccessfully, by protecting the concept of the consent of the original family members and to give them some dignity in the process. And then we've struggled with the lifelong losses that they have. In surrogacy, at the outset, we have a problem in that we are paying money for a relinquishment. And the only way that that is not, as far as I can tell, the sale of a child, which in the adoption context is just a crime, the only way it's not the sale of a child is if we can define surrogacy as a situation where the so-called surrogate, if she's genetically unrelated, is never the mother. And that's the way I understand that in India and in California, surrogacy is defined. There's no question of her consent once she's pregnant, her ability to revoke, her ability to change her mind, her ability to do anything. The child in the first instance belongs to the commissioning parents, and she's never a mother. And that legal conception is completely contrary to what we've tried to develop in the adoption area, as we've given dignities to so-called birth mothers as first mothers, and it's completely contrary to any concept of consent. And it's built into the Hague Adoption Convention that if you pay the mother to relinquish, it's not a proper relinquishment, whereas she's being paid to relinquish. Now, I'm a lawyer, so I understand you can try to structure it contractually. You can make it 75-25. You can give her 75% of the money up front and only 25%. But I am a legal realist as well, which is the commissioning parents would not pay to have this done if they weren't ensured that they get the baby at the end. And so she's being paid not just for the service, but she's being paid that it's not her child. It's sort of like the joke about why do celebrities pay for sex? You know, all these people want to have sex with them. Why do they pay for sex? They don't pay for sex for the sex. They pay for the sex to be able to walk away. And in surrogacy, you're paying for this service, if I can be blunt, so you can walk away with the child without any strings attached. You're paying for the lack of strings attached. That is what you're really paying for. And so, again, that is the negative viewpoint. And yes, you can be even blunter than me, Hilbrand, okay? So, but the idea of a reproductive service, and it was, that comparison was made this morning when we talked about India giving dignity to sex workers, and that is part of the heritage of India. So, you know, that is part of the comparison that is being made. That is part of the field when you're in ART or in the reproductive field. So I hope that's provocative enough to get you all started. Okay, thanks.
Okay, who wants to follow up on that? Amrita, thanks.
Okay, I don't have this formulated very well in my head, but since I've been provoked, I have to respond. Couple of things which have been coming into my mind during these discussions, especially the very productive discussions we had right now when we were, the global surrogacy track was with the adoption track. And some of the things which I find puzzling but also important. One, there seems to be a bit of a lack of consensus. Do we have too much discussion about best interest of child, or do we have too little discussion about the best interest of child? So, so for instance, when we got together the adoption track and the global surrogacy track, one of the things that was brought to our attention is that there's too much discussion about the best interest of the other stakeholders, but not so much about the best interest of child. And we responded to that by pointing out that that is true. In some discourses, there is a lot of discussion about the surrogate mother and the intended parents and very little about the best interest of child. But in other discussions, actually, there is too much discussion about the best interest of child, perhaps because we're trying to draw parallels between global surrogacy and international adoption and not realizing that there are many other parallels that we need to also talk about. For instance, the one that was just brought about between sex work and global and surrogacy. So, as I said, this is not well formulated yet, so I'll come back to this thought. But the other thing that is connected to this is that the best interest of child and the best interest of surrogate mothers need not be in conflict. Very often we seem to suggest that these two one has to be prioritized over the other. That need not be the case. And some of the things that you just brought about in your provocation, we often talk about, as researchers and academics and sometimes activists and lawyers, we often talk about things in abstraction when they need not be talked about in abstraction. So for instance, when I started my work on surrogacy, there was not a lot of data on women's surrogates' voices, but now there is. So unfortunately, none of the surrogates are present here. But the fact is that there are many surrogates who have talked to many researchers, whether that be Sama, whether that be me, whether that be Daisy and Karen. And when you actually do pay attention and pay respect to their voices, you hear that there is a lot of conversation about exactly the same things that you brought about. So dignity of birth mother. So one thing that the surrogates want is dignity of birth mother, not erasing relationships. So one thing that the surrogates want is not erasing relationships. So you, as you said, you want to be a legal realist. I want to be a social realist and realize that surrogacy is existing, and whether we like it or not, it will continue to exist, sometimes underground, sometimes overground, sometimes in the global north, sometimes in the global south. So perhaps instead of trying to find parallels just between adoption and global surrogacy, I know that's the fora now, of course we have to do that, but I think it can become a bit counterproductive if we force ourselves to just think about this and not try and see what hits you on the face, that there are many differences between global surrogacy and global adoption, and one big factor being that there's this really big role that the birth mother can play, and very differently from adoption.
I thought of the question that came to my mind is, okay, here, like that? Okay, is it we are talking enough about the interest of the woman? And I don't know, actually, because there is no conflict between interest of the child and the interest of the woman, but yet there is a place to discuss about the woman interest. And I can tell, and I think I told it for few people, and I said it again because it's very important to me, to learn some of the experience we have in Israel. We have a lot of data thanks to researchers like Eti Semama. And one of the things is when surrogacy is a good experience for women is when it's a relationship. Long-term relationship. It's not a commercial, it's not an object that go from one hand to the other, but long term. And in that relationship, she have a stand. She look at this surrogacy as a meaningful things that she part of. And the other things that I think we need to think when we think about any convention is that 60% of that contract of surrogacy doesn't finish with a live child. It means that 60% of the women who've been signed on the contract didn't finish this process. And we don't know why. We don't know what's happened to this woman. And I'm sure if we look at all of this country with the surrogacy, we are, and I'm sure that we, most of the research interview women that been in surrogacy process and have a child. What's happened with those women who didn't have a live child? Are they part of this discussion about their side effects, about health, about emotional, social aspect? I think we need to consider also those group of women.
Thanks, Edva. Who else? Hervé and then Deepa.
Okay, I'm very confused, so I will try to to explain you my confusion. When I came yesterday, starting this conference, I was quite convinced about the necessity to regulate international surrogacy and trying to support efforts to go, for instance, for a new Hague Convention on surrogacy, whatever it can be. But the more we discuss and the more exchanges I have with many of you, the more confused I am, as I said, because one of the points I discussed was the fact that today we have quite a number of countries in the north who have decided not to allow commercial surrogacy, mainly European countries. In the same time, we have people going for international surrogacy anyway. So we are facing a situation where we have children born out of this system, and where the so-called receiving countries have to find a solution for that, which lead us to the conclusion that we should regulate this. But if we regulate, don't we give the good reasons for those who are going for international surrogacy anyway, and with the risk that a regulation, a convention, whatever it can be, could only give an approval on this practice. And when we hear the different examples of, for instance, the presentation about Israel, when she explained that in a certain situation, the agency would find a Hague in South Africa, implement the Hague in a Thai woman we will deliver in Nepal, because all these three countries have different regulations, so that by finding a way you would be on the safe legal side in each of these different countries, just at the end to get a baby, it makes the system a bit crazy to me. So I don't know where we are going with, I mean, there are a lot of issues and problems to be discussed, but to me, one of the first one was this question of international convention or not. Should we go for that or not? I don't have the answer, but I would be quite disappointed to leave tomorrow evening without any answer to this question. Thank you.
But Hervé, I wasn't clear, and I don't know, maybe others were. You were saying that your doubts now about the desirability of a convention are based on the fact that you think it would encourage more traffic, or not trafficking, but traffic.
Not necessarily encouraging trafficking, but legitimizing a situation that is today unsatisfactory, but it is unsatisfactory because people are not respecting their own legislation. Because Swiss, French, or Spanish people are going to India knowing that they are not supposed to do so, and pushing institutions or conferences to discuss the issues.
Deepa, do you want to go next? Okay, then Carmel, and then Francoise and Laura, and then we'll go back to Deepa.
Thank you very much for that. I must say that my mind is also opening and opening and opening, and I'm really grateful for the confusion and the lack of clarity, because that's what's supposed to happen. But I would like to follow up on what you said, and there is a really inherent problem with the double standard. Because when we allow our nationals to go elsewhere to do things that are prohibited in our country, we're condoning a double standard, and a double standard is ethically suspicious. And the other thing is that in international organ transplantation context, there is talk of national self-sufficiency as a principle of regulation. National self-sufficiency, so I'm just introducing this as some more food for thought. Can you say what that means? National it means that we answer the needs of our own nationals and we don't export the excess demand to other countries.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Francoise next, and then Laura, and then Deepa.
Yeah, I guess I want to sort of continue that conversation and say that I too share those concerns, because I've actually framed that in terms of us endorsing the exportation of exploitation. And I see that in a context where in Canada the law is written in such a way that it's very clear. It uses the language of exploitation and commodification, and it specifically prohibits payment for contract pregnancy. However, our government has said we have no extraterritorial responsibilities, and so if people leave Canada and do something completely outside the jurisdiction of Canada, it will not, in fact, pursue those issues because it does not see that it has any enforcement responsibility. And I think that that's deeply problematic, and I think it's worth interrogating, because there are other areas of law where countries, and I'm only going to use Canada because it's the one I know, will in fact say that there is extraterritorial jurisdiction. And one of those areas, for example, has to do with child prostitution. We don't allow you to say, well, you can't do it in Canada, but go do it in the Philippines. If we find out you're doing it in the Philippines, in theory, we can go after you. Now, again, how often that happens may be subject to question, but the government has accepted that it has extraterritorial responsibility. So one of the things that I think is worth thinking about is what does it say when a swath of countries say no, but then will tolerate, and in some cases perhaps even encourage, their own nationals to go and do that which they prohibit within their own borders.
Thanks,
and just a comment for those who are interested in the concept of self-sufficiency. Dominic Martin and Gillian Crozier are authors who have written quite a lot about self-sufficiency, specifically with respect to assisted human reproduction. They've written together, and what's interesting is that they hold different views about that, so you don't necessarily know that when you read their papers that are written together, but they have now got papers coming out separately. And so now you can see whose voice is which. And Dominic Martin is the one arguing for self-sufficiency, and Gillian Crozier is arguing for a regulated market. And so those are articles that I think may be of interest to you, because they are in fact looking at the issue of how do you regulate with two very different perspectives. Thanks.
Okay, Laura, next.
Okay. I don't know if I necessarily disagree with the position David took, but I'm going to formulate a counter-argument nevertheless. But no, because I don't know what I think. And it seems to me that these are issues that continually are getting hashed out. First of all, surrogacy does not necessarily end in a pregnancy. I just want to reiterate that. 60% of the time it doesn't work. So this is not a contract for a baby. This is a contract for labor. And so I think we need to ask whether the appropriate analogy is inter-country adoption or if it's sex work. And if it's sex work, if we should think about opportunities for organizing, and we should think about opportunities for better labor contracts for surrogates. Two, I don't think that we should necessarily assume an analogy with adoption when it comes to the question of how the narrative within which a future child will understand this relationship. Gestational surrogacy is complicated, right? On the one hand, it's very much a maternal-like relationship. On the other hand, where there are no gametes involved, how we narrativize that is going to have a great deal of effect on how another generation is going to understand it. And to justify that, I turn to the work of those like Kim Park Nelson, who tell us about the generational differences in how adoptees have understood their experience. That changes over time because kinship is always a narrative. And so it seems to me unclear. Let me say that. It seems murky. Finally, it seems to me like the question of an international treaty may have paradoxical consequences. That is, we can look to two examples from the States to say that when gestational surrogacy is clearly regulated, or any kind of surrogacy, ultimately it was gestational surrogacy, when its legal status is clearly demarcated, as in California, the industry takes off. Where its legal status is not clearly demarcated, as in New Jersey, it turns out that those who enter into surrogacy contracts, the women who carry the children, have more rights or have potentially more opportunity to dispute these contracts. And finally, last point is, given the varied status of surrogacy across the United States and across Mexico, it seems like the fact of diverse legal statuses has not necessarily been an obstacle to people being able to live with them. In other words, I can point to those as counterexamples that suggest we may not have an urgent need for a treaty in the near future.
Okay, thank you. Deepa, do you want to speak? Okay. Okay, great. Andrew?
I just wanted to respond to one thing that Laura said. So I think the argument was it can't be a contract for a baby because sometimes a baby isn't produced. But it depends on what happens with the money. So if the baby isn't produced and you're not paid, then I agree that's not a contract if the baby isn't produced and you get paid the full amount, then it's not a contract for a baby. But if the contract depends on whether or not a live child is produced in the end, then it seems to me it's a contract for a child. And anyways, so.
Okay. Well, let's see. Diane hasn't spoken. Right here.
I'm very interested in the argument that the best analogy is sex work. But I have a problem with that, in that there is a human being produced. It's not just about the worker, it's about the child. So I'd like to know how people who want us to look at this as paid labor deal with that.
Shri, do you want to say? You want to talk? Oh. There's no actual sex involved. Okay, Peter.
Can I thank you for that point? I think this is the absolutely essential thing that's missing. The hidden dimension in all of this discussion is the child that is born. And we have to come back to that. And there's a whole, and this applies incidentally also to the gestational surrogacy that is altruistic. And we haven't even thought through this. So, I mean, I would like to come back to this question of records and of what is to be told to the child. And we're going back to the days in adoption when you didn't tell the child he was adopted. We're going back to the days of sperm donation, which is, it's only like blood donation. We have got to tackle this issue. Is this something the child born in this way should be told? If so, is it important to make sure that we have records that that child could access? If so, what is it that's going to be the mechanism for doing that? In other words, we need the records. We don't know. I've seen no evidence or details about what the commissioning parents think about this. Is it just, is it something, well, of course we're going to tell him, or we would if we knew. And I mean, I was just very struck by our discussion in the last group when the issue in Israel was brought up and the issue of gay surrogacy was brought up. And it seemed, well, actually there, those people probably are going to tell. They're going to have to give an explanation, and this may be a very helpful explanation. Second thing is, what about the contact? I mean, Dan will remember this, but I mean, when I was in the conference in Pontevedra, I was so struck by the gay professor with his partner who talked about a commissioning of an altruistic surrogacy in inverted commas by a professor in the States who said she was, yes, I mean, it was altruistic, but she was quite well paid. It was just not very commercial. But the important thing was that she had come over to see the child because she followed what the progress was and to talk to people. And that opened up all sorts of new things. So what I'm saying is there's a whole host of things that we need to talk. I don't know the answers to this, and they've got to be starting with the fact that there is a child there, and if we know the origins, then that child has a right.
Okay, let's hear from this person here who hasn't spoken yet, and then Amrita, and then Diane.
I couldn't agree more with you that there is a hidden child in this equation. But the thing is, there is a potential child. And if we go into the realms of a commercial surrogacy, we have to question ourselves if it's okay to be brought into this world in exchange for payment. So this is a very, very essential question. And then, only then, if we have agreed on that part, we can even enter into the discussion about being informed and information about your descent. But it's the mere question of, is it okay that you've been brought into this world because of a payment?
Amrita, and then Diane, and then Deepa, and then Carolyn.
I've already spoken, so I'll be quick on this. Again, to respond to the question about why is this conversation about sex work coming up, and also responding to the question of do we really need an international convention. So two of my thoughts, interconnected thoughts on this. One, as I said, I don't think there is a conflict between best interest of child and best interest of surrogate mothers, and that is why there is a need to look at two levels of international convention. One, there is a lot to learn from the inter-country adoption lens, precisely because, unlike the sex work case, there is a living product. And we cannot ignore the fact that invisible or visible, there is a child. So the interest of the child has to be kept in mind, which of course, in the sex work activism or sex work laws, we don't have to consider. But the reason why I and some other people also want a discussion about the parallels between global surrogacy and sex work is so that, along with the best interest of the child, you can also bring in conversations which have happened at the international level about labor regulations. So if we start at least considering that this is, surrogacy is an existing form of labor and a labor choice made by many women in many parts of the world, then we can, along with thinking about best interest of the child and learning from inter-country adoption, learn from international labor regulations and make sure that whatever exploitative potential exists in this kind of a labor market, that exists in many parts of the global south especially, can be least exploitative for the people who are at the lowest in this hierarchy, which are the workers, the surrogates themselves. Hence, there is a need to constantly talk at two levels: sex work, labor parallels, and inter-country adoption and child parallels, and the child being a product in the surrogacy market parallels, which links to the question about international convention. And I think I just alluded to that. I think a problem is when we try to find domestic solutions to a global issue like surrogacy, there's going to be problems. So if we just try to solve this domestically and have national laws, whether that be prohibitive or morally sticky, so if nations decide that we as a nation are going to only allow altruistic surrogacy, or we are going to ban surrogacy altogether, then what happens is that you just pass on that problem to another country. So we do need an international convention. But that international convention needs to recognize the surrogates as workers and have their voices on the platform.
Thanks, Amrita. Diane is next in the queue.
I just wanted to get back briefly to this point about the child's right to know their origins, because usually when this issue is discussed, it's discussed in terms of genetic origins. Who is the sperm provider? Who is the egg provider? And I just want to pick up on the point that kinship narratives do change, and that somebody in one of our discussions brought up some good information about how much the health of the mother in the years before the pregnancy have consequences for the child in the future. But also the narrative of health is changing and expanding from genetics to epigenetics. And we're beginning to understand so much more about the interaction between the genes and the fetal environment that will in the future likely become a very important to the child, much more so than is the case currently.
Thank you. And Deepa is next in the queue. Karen,
we keep talking about surrogacy and we talk about it as commercial surrogacy, and then there's some other kind of surrogacy. I don't know. I mean, it's not being stated very clearly. So are we saying it's okay in certain circumstances and it's not? And what is this, altruistic surrogacy? I think we need to really understand what we kind of in this room, or all of us here, understand by altruistic surrogacy, because a lot of the discussions in India, we are kind of concerned that there is probably no altruistic surrogacy, given the kind of power hierarchies that exist amongst those who are possibly going in for surrogacy, not necessarily for payment, but might be kind of. So, we need to have that conversation for more clarity as to, are we talking about certain surrogacies being okay and certain not, and those kind of conversations need to happen. Secondly, I really want to take forward or endorse what Amrita just said. One is that when the paper from the Hague Convention came up, and it largely was motivated in the context of surrogacy, it was largely motivated by the best interest. The child was central to that, and I think that's very important. And I think, for example, in the morning when I presented about certain steps being taken by India through that Ministry of Home Affairs, where there's some pre-permission and things like that, I mean, there are concerns even within domestic kind of circles to see that the child is protected, the citizenship issues of statelessness do not occur. But I think we need to also take that conversation forward to look at the surrogate who is very central to this arrangement, central to this thing, and do we look at it as work, do we look at it as labor, and what are the frameworks we can kind of really look at surrogacy within is something we need to kind of talk about.
Thanks, Deepa. Okay, we've got a queue of Carolyn, Karen, Rhoda, and Hilbrand. So Carolyn? Sorry? Oh, no, Carolyn was next. I'm sorry, Karen.
Sorry, I just wanted to bring the discussion back for a minute to the issue of openness and what that might look like open adoption, some kind of open surrogacy arrangement in an international context. I'm very much in favor of that, but one sort of worry I see, especially if it takes the form of people actually having, ongoing continuous contact relationships, is that it might have the effect of actually encouraging, say in the context of adoption, more, women in the community giving up their children. I mean, I know some international adoptive families where the parent, they do have contact, their adoptions are more open than some domestic adoptions I know, but they feel compelled in some, especially if the birth family is in any dire need, they feel compelled to help them out, and it's hard to resist that sort of urge, but then, there's more and more families might think, oh, well, I want this kind of arrangement too. I mean, I'm going to give up my child for adoption because I want to know this Western family that's going to help me out if if my family's in any kind of dire need. And the same thing might happen in a surrogacy context. So while I'm very much in favor of openness, I think, you know, how that might look and what might be sort of best practices around openness in the international context. I mean, I'm just not sure what that would look like. So,
Okay. Karen, go ahead. You want to come up here?
So one of the things that's really actually quite confusing is there's different camps that we found in the inter-country adoption world, which is you have the proponents, and they are promoting this is a wonderful thing, and we're seeing a lot of really good material out and some popular literature around rescuing children, and that's that narrative. And the adoption agencies very much promote that, the proponents. And of course, we know why they're the proponents to some degree, because they really like their jobs, and they're really good jobs, by the way. They get to do interesting travel, and they get families that love them, and you made my family happen. It's really an exciting job for them. You have a group of people who are abolitionists, and they simply think that this should not continue. We have enough evidence to close it down. Okay? And the evidence is pretty compelling when you really collate it and look at it. There's been a lot of bad things that have happened. And then you have the largest group, the pragmatists. And the pragmatists have said, okay, look, it's happening. This is a part of who we are, especially in the United States context. This is a part of who we are. We have a book called Adoption Nation that's a top seller. And we need to get real about how to do this well. And by the way, we haven't really figured out how to do it that well, even with all the regulations. We still have a lot of problems. But there are three camps. And frankly, there really aren't many people in the abolitionist camp. There really aren't. And I've done the analysis, most people are actually in the pragmatic camp because it's happening and it needs to be regulated. And that's part of the confusion we're having. We haven't come to that any kind of conclusion in this group, and I don't expect to be, but I just wanted to point out there are different narratives taking place here which create this kind of can't get traction.
Can I ask, when you're talking about that, when you say the majority of people sit in the camp, so how do we make this happen well, are you talking about adoption in that sense? Because the majority of the world actually prohibits commercial surrogacy.
Yeah, I'm talking about, we've done the analysis of what's happening in the adoption literature and the discourse.
It's a different conversation when you're talking about commercial surrogacy, because I would say perhaps there's a camp, you know, you have your three camps, but I don't think once you move outside of your academic circles that you actually have that same majority.
Well, and I'm not saying that there's only three camps. There's because there's even far more dynamics. There's you know where the eggs come from, where the women are, etc. But I think that the problem is there's different conversations and people have arrived at different places with this. And I'm just going to tell you that the pragmatists and the people who don't want to see it happen are really at a place right now. It's like we're having two different conversations.
Okay. Hilbrand, go ahead.
Yeah, it's working. I've never seen myself as someone from one or another camp, but somehow I get a feeling now that I have to choose. Maybe that might be the problem now. But to be more serious, I'm really worried. And I'm really concerned right now. Because where does this stop? If we're not able, or at least considering to say no to something which is really worrisome, where does this stop? If we will follow the path of pragmatism, does that mean that at a certain day we have factories where babies are born and we accept it? Because it is pragmatic? I want you to consider this, because maybe someone of you remember the book of Aldous Huxley, Brave New World. People at that time told Aldous Huxley, you're crazy, because this will never happen. And see what happens now. And if I realize his book, then I'm really worried. Because we're talking about here about technologies, about engineering children. But for me, we talk about life issues, life tissues, about life things which I cannot step out of it. I can think out of it, but thinking the technology is there, so we should use it, and the possibility is there, so we should enable it. But still, one day, you can have this child who's asking, what did you do for me to prevent it? And other thing is that I think this is a message I really want to share with those people who are into surrogacy, is that you have to consider the fact And that's what we learned from adoption, that even those adoptees who did not want to be involved in anything or felt anything with their adoption until they got ill and sick, and they needed genetic material to get better. So they needed to find the family of origin, and there things get really wrong. And I want you to consider that if you really want to save children from surrogacy practices, that they cannot reach these genetic families. That is something you really have to consider.
Okay. Rhoda.
A lot of our conversations are out of order because you raise your hand when you want to respond to something someone said, and then it's 4 places down the queue before you get to say it. So I'm responding to 2, actually now 3 comments. Somebody made a comment about money. We're paying money to buy children. We're paying money already. Adoptive parents pay a lot of money to go overseas to get a child. And people who are using IVF, they pay a lot of money to doctors to help them have children. So I see parallels. I'm just saying, to play devil's advocate, I see parallels, and I think money gets used, whether it's, in this case, it's to the woman. That's the difference. And on some really weird, twisted level, God, it's about time that the person who needed the money got the money, rather than the agencies or the doctors. On some weird level, that's how I feel. To the comment about altruistic surrogacy, in New Zealand, that's what we have. And what that means is that if I wanted to have a child and I couldn't, I would ask someone I know if they would be willing to have a child for me. And if they said yes, it's because they want to. It's not for any other political motive. And in New Zealand, we have lots of regulations around assisted reproductive technologies, and we keep records. And we preference the right of the offspring to have their knowledge when they're ready for it or when they reach maturity. And we've been keeping those records for decades. And we have lots of other laws that say you can only surrogate to one or you can only donate to one family, because we don't want lots of unknown siblings out there hooking up with each other after the fact because they don't realize that they're biologically related. So that's an example of a country that's already having some of these conversations, but not yet on the global level. We don't have commercial surrogacy, but I worry that some of our residents will find those laws restrictive and want to go overseas. So I'm here to participate in this conversation, in this dialogue. And actually, that's my contribution.
We've raised so many issues, and David has his hand up, and we do need to stop at 6 o'clock, Kristen, right? Okay, go ahead, David. Okay, thank you, David. Any last comments before we break? Okay, well, I think this has truly been a provocative conversation. And Kristen, when will we start the film? Okay, this is like a 7th inning stretch, 5 minutes. And then we'll start the film, and Deepa will be here to answer questions.